Um, so welcome everybody. I managed not to say Shabbat Shalom or good morning, which were my concerns. Um, so welcome everybody to our you know, reboot, I guess, of the Thinking Tuesdays program. We're going to do one every other week through the high holidays, and then we're going to kind of go on hiatus for November and then be back on a monthly basis in December. That's the plan. And I guess next high holiday season, we'll just kind of do it more frequently for a little while again, like this. So I've got this titled, What Aren't We Saying? Understanding the Roots of High Holiday Services. And um, we don't, as humanistic Jews, go digging very often in the two-volume monstrosity that is the modern Orthodox uh, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur Machzorim, the prayer books. But they are quite large. Each one is the size of a typical Orthodox Siddur all on its own, just for one day, right? Yom Kippur is the longer volume, and it's really only one day. It's even in the name. Yom Kippur means Day of Atonement. So we don't often look at them, but there's stuff in there that, one, I think it's useful for us to look at and know about, just general knowledge, right? If humanistic Judaism thinks that Judaism is the full culture of the Jewish people, this is part of our culture too, even if we're not engaging with it in the way that an Orthodox Jew might, for example. So I think it's worthwhile just knowing about some of the stuff that's in there. And for a lot of us, we grew up in contact with, if we grew up at a synagogue, we grew up at a suburban synagogue of some kind where none of this was explained. And you went to Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur services and you just sat there and like words just kind of flowed from the front of the room and you didn't necessarily know what any of them meant. And when you looked at the translation on the other side of the book, assuming you had a translation, it wasn't necessarily terribly meaningful. There's only so many lines of, Our Father, our King, you can read before it just numbs out for a lot of people when no one's telling them what's going on. So a little bit of this is just what's going on, but a little bit of it is also how are we different? And knowing the structure of things helps us know how we're different when you look at a traditional structure. So that's what we're going to kind of do we're going to spend a lot of time over these next four sessions looking at really traditional material, but from our perspective to be able to understand where it fits us, where it doesn't, where we get things from. Because unless you know where things are coming from, you don't really know where things are coming from. That's a little bit circular, but that's just how things go. So that was the what will we cover. Um, a lot of us engage the same way with Shabbat services as we might have with high holiday services. It's just words from the front, and we don't really know what was going on the bima or the stage in front of us. So we'll take a little bit of time to understand the general structure of traditional Jewish liturgy, just your day-to-day stuff. Um, and then we'll talk some about the ideas that are underneath the high holidays, what's going on, because that helps us understand why things change. And then we'll look at, in a general way, the changes in services because of the high holidays. And I say in a general way because this is a modern Orthodox daily use prayer book. Covers your weekdays, covers Shabbat, covers a lot of holidays. There's a wedding ceremony in here. There's confession upon your deathbed in here. There's funeral in here. There's all kinds of stuff. There's a whole section that's just on all of the laws for what happens if you get interrupted when you're doing this or that, right? This is all stuff that's important in the Orthodox world, but this is all year. And each one of these is a day or two. So you can kind of see the scope of the changes. They're very significant. And so we'll look at some of those changes and we'll look at how we pull from them and how we don't. The goal is understanding the themes of the high holidays from humanistic Judaism's perspective. And, you have to know what makes things tick. How does Kol Nidre work? Because there's a kind of choreography to Kol Nidre that we use during our Kol Nidre service, but if you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't know it was there. What's going on in these books, right? This huge book that gets used during the high holidays that no one can actually use every page of the book. No matter how fast you are, you just can't use the whole book. What are the most commonly known pieces? Because a lot of us may not know the commonly known pieces, and we may not know some really significant traditional pieces of the books that we had no idea they were happening because they're among the many things that just kind of fly at you when you're in a more traditional synagogue. There's not somebody standing up there saying, and now we're going to start this. And some of the this is really, really, really unusual stuff that only shows up in the high holidays. And if you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't know what was happening. And it's not like these books have really great headings to tell you this is where you are in the service. This is where we are. This is what we're talking about. The ones that I have on my desk with me right now that I've been holding up have commentary on the bottom of the page. But if you are not a pretty well-educated Orthodox Jew, you have no idea what's going on with those comments. And they're not for us. They're for the people who go to those kinds of synagogues. So we want to piece some of that apart. And today we're just going to look at the structure of the traditional material, compare it to the structure of ours a little bit. We're going to look at some of how this works out in music and video and how it works out in broader Jewish culture. Because one of the things that you discover is liturgical music makes its way into more popular settings. So we'll look at some of that too, because that's where things get okay. If you're me, that's where things get fun. If you're not me, maybe you don't think it's fun. That's okay. So I wanted to start with some vocabulary because I'm going to say stuff, and there's a good chance you're not going to know what I'm saying. So Machzor is the prayer book that's specific to biblical holidays. And I said that the Machzor is the book for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and that is true. The Machzor is also the name applied to special kind of one-use sidduros, right? These prayer books, these one-use prayer books for Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Biblical holidays have their own books and have their own prayer books because there's a lot of supplemental stuff because those are the crucial holidays as far as the Torah is concerned. The Torah does not know what Purim is. The Torah does not know what Hanukkah is, but it sure does know Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and the pilgrimage holidays. So that's what those Machzorim cover. It is starting to be the case that there are Machzorim, these books, the Machzors, there are Machzorim for Israeli holidays. And specifically, either or both, Yom HaAtzmaut, right, Israeli Independence Day, and then Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day. These are the product of religious Zionism. They're pretty modern. Not everybody thinks that this is the way to go, but they are starting to come into being and they're starting to get kind of popular. The next term, nusach, there are two ways of saying the plural, nusachim, if you're doing Hebrew, and nuschaot, if you're doing Yiddish. So actually, nuschaos, if you're doing Yiddish. And this word has kind of two basic meanings. One of them is the order of the prayers and their contents for a specific group. So this Orthodox Siddur has on it, and you can't really see it, but I just take my word for it. My finger is pointing to a word in Hebrew. It's not going to stay in focus. There we go. Is pointing to a word in Hebrew. The word is Ashkenaz. So this is the Siddur as Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews would use it. Germany, Russia, Poland, Hungary, right? That area of the world. As opposed to Sephardim, as opposed to Italian Jews, as opposed to Greek Jews, right? There are all of these different Jewish groups, and they have their own nusachim, their own kind of course of prayers. And it also refers to the melodic tropes used for public recitation or chanting of the text described in the books. And so this word nusach, which is misspelled in the middle of the paragraph, comes from a root that means uproot or tear away or formulate. And so the idea is these are formulaic patterns. This is the formula for how you do this thing in this kind of congregation. This is the formula for how you're going to sing aloud these long passages that we don't necessarily recognize for what they are, but there are patterns to these pieces of music, these melodies, and we'll look at those a little bit. Shaliach Tzibor, or Shatz, Shatz is just the abbreviation in Hebrew, is a representative of the community. And this is where I tell you, you don't need a rabbi, but please keep me around. Is not the tradition 200 years ago. You would not have found the rabbi leading Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services. That's not how it worked. You would have a Shaliach Tzibor who was somebody who was a really good singer and knew this stuff and was particularly well respected and particularly religious, and they knew that he kept Shabbat the right way and all of this kind of stuff. That was the person who led services. You don't need a rabbi to get married even. We kind of have this thought that you do, but that's secular American law that demands you have somebody accredited to sign off on your license. That's not Jewish tradition. Amidah is standing, this central unit of traditional Jewish prayer that everything else is kind of built around. The job of the Amidah is to replace sacrifices in the temple, and we'll see how that kind of pans out. There's a specific structure to it, and it is the Amidah, more than anything else, that is changed by the high holidays. So the preliminary material gets a little bit of supplementation here and there. The Amidah explodes isn't the right word, but expands many, many times in length. That's how we know it's the high holidays in the book, is all of this new stuff comes in. And we'll see just how much this stuff gets amplified. And bracha is a blessing. I'm going to say bracha every so often. Brachot is the plural, just so you know, in case this is not a Hebrew word, it's going to pop up. This is a thing I'll say. So those 5 words, right? Nusach, Nusachim, Nuschaot, Shatz, Shaliach Tzibor, right? Machzor, Amidah, and bracha, those are going to come up. And easier to tell you now so that you know they're coming than I don't define them when I use them and then you're lost. That's not good. So general structure. Traditional Jewish law, right? Traditional approach to Jewish prayer and Jewish life and liturgy has services that happen 3 times a day. Morning, shacharit. Shacharit just means dawn. Mincha, mincha means gift, but it refers to the afternoon, post-noon, post-midday. It's hard to put times to these because Jewish hours, halachic hours for prayer are based on the sun. They're not based on what's on our wrists. So afternoon, mincha, this post-midday thing, and then evening or ma'ariv. These are the 3 kind of main pieces of the day, and they correspond to sacrifices that the rabbis say occurred in the temple. Shacharit is a lot longer than the other two because there's all of these other things that you would say at the beginning of the day in order to kind of hit all these other things. People who put on a talit are going to say the blessing for the talit. People who put on tefillin are going to say three blessings for putting on tefillin because there's one for the wrapping around your arm, one for your head, one for your hand, right? So there are a lot of things going on. People say um, a blessing for being able to use the bathroom. People say a blessing for being able to study Torah, and there's a piece of Torah that's in most Siddurim to do all of this, right? So 3 times a day, we have these chunks of liturgy that people kind of just do. And it's really normal. If you are in New York City, it's really normal to discover that your office building has a minyan, right? A 10, usually men, getting together in the afternoon to do mincha so that everybody does what they need to do and so that they can say Kaddish for anybody who's deceased because you need 10 people in the room to do that. The explanation for that is way past anything we want to talk about here today. So the next question is kind of how do the times of the day come in? Where do we come from? And it's basically, as I said, during the existence of the first and second temples, what became Judaism centered on sacrifices offered in the temple. That was religion, not people doing things privately in their homes. Judaism wasn't that. Judaism was what happened in the temple. And if you couldn't engage with what happened in the temple, you were distanced from Jewish life, right? This is really Israelite religion. After the destruction of the second temple, the rabbis replaced the sacrifices. They know they need a structure. They know that they need something in order to be able to continue all of this. How do we continue all of this? What do? We don't have the building, but we have prayer. We'll use prayer. The prayers are going to equal the sacrifices. That's a really shortcut version of their thought process. The key ingredient to each one of these three is the Amidah. The Amidah is really the thing that really replaces the sacrifices. So just using the reaction thing, raise your hand if you thought the Shema was the most important thing. I'll be able to see in the participants list. And if your Zoom is really smart, you might even be able to just physically raise your hand, right? You can do that, and sometimes Zoom reads it, right? So a couple of people said, yeah, the Shema, that's the most important thing. Not necessarily for the rabbis. The rabbis thought that the Shema was important, and the Torah says you do the Shema, so they said you do the Shema, but you only do it twice a day. This is the important thing, is the Amidah. The Amidah is what replaces sacrifices. And so over time, what happened is more and more things were put in place around the Amidah, and you get some preliminary psalms, and then you get blessings before and after the Shema, and you have the Baruch Hu, which is like a call to prayer. So people who think only Muslims have a liturgical call to prayer, traditional Judaism has it too. You see a building up of the structure around the Amidah, but the Amidah is the important part because the Amidah is what's replacing sacrifices, and sacrifices are in the Torah. Sacrifices are how you fix relationships with God. That's the thing that fixes everything according to the Torah. So you need something to replace it. That's the rabbi's thought, and they used the Amidah. The text for the Amidah is probably 1,800 years old. It has not changed much. It is really, as these things go, simple Hebrew, so that people with just a smattering of Hebrew knowledge could understand what they were saying. And the point of all of this, as I said, was to replace the temple sacrifices. That's the basic job of this book, right? This everyday, this is like quote unquote pocket sized, right? Because like physically, my hand is bigger than this thing, but I don't know what pocket you put this in. It's not going to go, right? And it won't really fit in most coat pockets either. So that's what this is doing. That's what this sky blue book is doing. I guess it's sky blue, is replacing the temple sacrifices. That's what the rabbis think. There's a bookmark. That's why it's called services. Do you ever stop and think, why do we call this services? Why is it called services when I go to XYZ place? Turns out they're called services because it's divine service. You are, when you offer sacrifices in the temple, the idea is that you are serving the God of Israel. So we say services as a translation of the word avodah, which means service. And avodah was the word used to describe what happened in the temple. It's a really direct line. We just don't necessarily think about it. That's why we call it services. Except that's really uncomfortable if you stop and think about it as a humanistic Jew. It's really uncomfortable to say services if you stop and think about what you're doing, because that's not what we think is happening. So that's a complicated piece of it, right? We're going to advertise our high holiday services because that's the word that Jews use. But that's not what we think we're doing. And so there's no good replacement. You can say celebration, I guess, but is Yom Kippur a celebration? I don't know. You could say holiday, but that doesn't really work either, right? There's this word, and this word seems to work for a lot of people, and it's the word used in the broader Jewish world. So we have to use it. That's just kind of like how life goes. Yeah, so Kathy suggests observance. Observance would be a good one. Um, it's just that nobody uses it. So if we said our Yom Kippur observance, they would say, I observe Yom Kippur, I go to synagogue. You're going to go to synagogue. What do you mean? It, it's really hard to get a good word for this. So we're stuck with the word that we've got, I think, at least when we're talking outside. This is the general pattern of the three daily services so that we know what we're looking at, because this is also the general pattern for what happens on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in a more traditional setting. There's opening material, it's mostly Psalms. There's way more in the morning than in the afternoon and evening, and there is a prayer called the Ashrei. The Ashrei prayer is a combination of one psalm plus bits and pieces of two other psalms. And it starts off, Ashrei yoshvei veitecha, happy are those who dwell in your house. So who's the you? It's not me. It's um, the God of Israel. That's who's being addressed. So you have that. You've got all this preliminary material. You have the Baruch Hu. So if you've been to a traditional synagogue for services, you've seen the Baruch Hu, even though you might not recognize it for what it is. There are people who stand up, and the rabbi or the cantor or somebody up at the front says a line and bows, and then everybody else says another line and bows, and then the guy at the front, the woman in the front, or the person in the front, then says what the people said and bows again. That's the Baruch Hu, and it's called the Baruch Hu because the first word's Baruch Hu. Judaism is not necessarily creative in how it names things. It just goes for the first recognizable word for a passage, and that's what it calls it. So the Shema and its blessings. So there are the Shema itself, and right, it's actually three paragraphs. And then around it are brachot, are blessings, and it's always two before. There's always two blessings before the Baruch Hu, before the Shema, and sometimes there's one and sometimes there's two after, and it depends on the time of day. Just kind of how that works. And then you get the Amidah. And then in the morning, you get Ashrei again. Ashrei gets used a lot. Then you get this thing called Tachanun. Tachanun does not happen on holidays. Um, you may have seen Tachanun done, and when Tachanun is done, very often it's really only on weekdays. You see people do this, and they put their forehead down on their arm, and they recite this set of penitential prayers that are roughly based on what the rabbis say King David said after the David and Bathsheba, the Bathsheba and that whole episode. Um, they say, well, this is what he said. Number one, do we know that King David existed? I don't know. Number two, did King David recite all of these psalms? The evidence suggests they weren't written yet in many cases, so no. Um, Monday, Thursday, Saturday in the morning, you have the Torah service. It's a lot longer on Saturdays than it is on Monday and Thursday. Why Monday and Thursday for reading the Torah? Those were the days when courts would sit at city gates. So the court would come around to your town on Monday or Thursday. And so the Torah was read aloud on Monday and Thursday because you read the law before they decide the law. Then there's this prayer called the Aleinu prayer. And the Aleinu prayer is this messianic era kind of prayer. We're looking forward to the day when everyone worships one God and everyone is one, right? Seems great, except there's like all of this stuff about, what happens to non-believers. This is a prayer that the early reform movement tried to drastically revise or even pull. If you look at the current Reform Siddur, their daily book, when Aleinu comes up, there are actually 4 different versions because they are very uncomfortable with what the Aleinu says, but they also realize that people have an emotional attachment to this tune. And it's the tune that people are attached to. It is not the text. They don't necessarily know what it says. And if they knew, they'd feel uncomfortable. You have Mourner's Kaddish. Every Kaddish is a divider for some piece of what's going on in the liturgy. Mourner's Kaddish happens to appear a bunch of times during the day. So you get Mourner's Kaddish at the end of all of these. And then there's some kind of wrap-up prayer, often Yigdal or Adon Olam. Yigdal is a poetic restatement of Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith. Maimonides didn't write it. It's a restatement. It has a tune that goes to it. Adon Olam has like 50,000 tunes, including one from one of the songs in Hamilton. An adaptation was created by the cantor at the Park Avenue Synagogue for that one. Rock Around the Clock. Many, many things in 4/4 time work really well with Adon Olam. So you'll hear people do Adon Olam in lots of different melodies when you kind of head out to more traditional synagogues. And sometimes they're really rock songs, which is bizarre, given that Adon Olam means Lord of the Universe. I've never quite understood the peppy, funny songs with a text that seems so very grave, actually. There are changes for Shabbat and for holidays. The opening material might change and expand. The Amidah is altered. There's only 7 blessings. The daily weekday Amidah has 19 blessings in it. The first 3 are the rabbis would say that there are 3 kinds of prayer. There is praise, request, and thanksgiving. And the Amidah goes in that order. 3 blessings that are, wow, God, look at all the stuff you did. 13 that are, God, would you please do this thing? And then another 3 that are, thanks God for all the stuff you did. And the rabbis say this is like how you would approach a king. So you approach the king and you say, King, you're awesome. Having appropriately brown-nosed you a little bit, I'm not going to ask for what I want, and then I'm going to say thank you. That's the rabbi's notion of how this works. Um, on Shabbat and holidays, there's actually only 7 blessings instead of the 19, because the rabbis thought you're not allowed to ask God to do stuff on Shabbat. So we only have 1 blessing, and it is a blessing requesting peace. Everybody wants peace. Peace doesn't work. We can do peace. That's that's what's going on. This is not me making the rules. This is me telling you what the rules are understood to be in a lot of communities. Each of the sections is not just a line of text, right? We are accustomed to thinking about a bracha, about a blessing, as like a line of text. These are paragraphs or even pages. So our thought, right? So if you come to our Shabbat services, you hear me say, Nivarech et ha'or ba'olam, nivarech et ha'or ba'adam, nivarech et ha'or shel Shabbat. Let us bless the light in the world. Let us bless the light in humanity. Let us bless the light of Shabbat. And that's the candle blessing. That is not what happens in the Amidah. Those blessings come at the end of paragraphs worth of material. There's lots of additional material in Shabbat services in particular, but also on other days, and much of this falls into the category of piyutim. Piyut is piyutim are prayer poems. A piyut is one prayer poem, one unit. These were mostly written in the Middle Ages. There's like a golden age of piyutim, and it is the piyutim that really let us know, one, it's Shabbat, and two, it's the high holidays. If you're in one of these traditional synagogues, what happens is your Amidah explodes. And there's all kinds of stuff there that would never be there any other time. And that's kind of why the books are so long, essentially. So just to sum up, services exist in traditional Jewish settings to replace sacrifices. There's a consistent structure from one time of day to the next, with variations for time of day and for holidays. Much of the traditional service is made up of core prayers with additional poetic selections called piyutim, right? These prayer poems. A prayer poet is a payatan. The first time I saw it, I thought they were miswriting paisan, and I really had no understanding of what was going on. But to be fair, I was 18 and had no idea. So these traditional poetic sections called piyutim appear occasionally. They don't dominate the material on the weekdays, and they don't dominate the material on Shabbat. They're a supplement. It's nice. Things like, for those who know chunks of the traditional Jewish Shabbat Friday night service, Lecha Dodi, that's a piyut, right? That's not, people weren't saying that 1800 years ago. That was written about 500 years ago and shows up in the services now. It's a piyut, it's a prayer poem, but it's very specific to Shabbat. And that's what happens with weekdays and Shabbats, is you have core material with some supplementation for the time of day or for the day of the week, or there are little insertions for less important holidays. So the Amidah has a paragraph that gets inserted if it's Hanukkah, has a paragraph that gets inserted for Purim. Non-biblical holidays, but still important enough to warrant some kind of a thing in the Amidah. And that's what it looks like. That's what this is, this weekday book. There's other, like I said, there are marriage rituals in here, and there's a section on all of the law for what happens if you get interrupted. There's rules based on where you are, and like, this is not a thing you want to go into tonight because we'll be there forever, and you still won't understand what was going on. But that's what these books are. These traditional prayer books. And when you walk into a conservative or Reconstructionist synagogue, by and large, That's also what's in there. And even in the Reform world bases its stuff on this traditional pattern. Shorter, more English, alternative readings, only one psalm instead of five, things like that, but still really following the pattern. The big difference, the big change for the Reform movement in the Amidah, this kind of central prayer, is they really were nervous about people thinking that God would raise the dead. One of the blessings in the traditional Amidah is Mechaye Hametim, who gives life to the dead. And so they edited it. Today, both versions are in the book and you can pick. So before we kind of move from there, are there questions? And you can raise your hand, you can unmute, whatever. You will not show up in our video. It's just going to be my head. So no one will know who you are, except for all of us. Yeah, Rick, go ahead.
Thanks so much. And it's really insightful. Thanks. Um, I spent a lot of time in Moroccan Sephardic synagogues, and what struck me was the priestly blessing. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So the priestly blessing, for you may have seen this. The priestly blessing has one or maybe all of the people who are Kohanim from the priestly line come to the front of the room, and they do, right? This is where Leonard Nimoy got Spock's thing, is the hand gesture used by the Kohanim. I am not a Kohen. This is really hard for me to do. They come to the front of the room, and there is it's a 2-page long, in most books, chunk of the service that shows up. And the core of the priestly blessing is, frankly, in Fiddler on the Roof. So Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, right? May the Lord bless you and protect you. May God guide your ways, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So it's a 3-line thing. Different Jewish cultures developed different approaches for this. So it is not necessarily an everyday thing or an every Shabbat thing, particularly in Ashkenazi synagogues. It's not a thing that happens all the time. It happens once or twice a year. It's actually very kind of special and unusual when it happens. In the Ashkenazi world, there's a Yiddish word for this. It's called duchenin. I can't remember what the Yiddish word duchenin actually means, but when someone says duchenin, they're talking about the priestly blessing being recited from the front of the room with hands like this. In Mizrahi, Mizrahi is a Hebrew word that means Eastern. The Jews of North Africa and the Middle East, some are Sephardic, right? Sephardi means Spanish. So some would really trace their customs to the Jews of Spain who left because of expulsion and had a heavy influence. And they had a heavy influence all the way across North Africa and into the Middle East. But there are differences. And so Mizrahi and Sephardi communities do this more often. It happens more regularly. There's a different set of cultural norms about the priestly blessing. There's a different set of cultural norms about what they think about rabbis. Right. So Arlene is pointing out in the comments, it's a big deal in an Orthodox congregation, heads covered by talit, special tune. This is not an everyday thing. It's a big deal when it happens in an Ashkenazi synagogue. In a Sephardic synagogue, it's more common. It's still a big deal, right? Because it's the priests coming forward. And the idea is these people were important in the way Israelite religion worked and the way Judaism worked when the temple stood. There's still a role. It's not a huge role, but there's still a role. Jack.
You, I think, alluded to this, but is it fair to say that reform, the reform movement, has tended toward a more traditional notion in both structure and content of these services than, say, well, certainly compared to its origins, but that say compared to 30, 40 years ago?
Yes. Um, so those who inhabited Reform synagogues or were using Reform Siddurim 30 or 40 years ago um, will remember, I don't have that book in this room. Um, the book was called Gates of Prayer, and Gates of Prayer had, I think, 11 or 12 Friday night Shabbat services. And they roughly followed the traditional structure, but there was much less material. There was much less Hebrew. It might only have the first line of the Shema and nothing else, and then some alternative readings. So it kind of generally followed this this outline. It would generally follow it, but it didn't do everything. And it didn't provide the full text for everything because this was a point in the reform movement when they really hadn't fully kind of come back around to this interesting place that they are now with tradition and traditional liturgy and what a commandment is. And this is a really key change that happened in the late 90s. Um, and the key change turned into a new Siddur. The current Siddur only has 4 Shabbat Friday night services instead of 11. And they're much more traditional. There's much more Hebrew. There's there tends to be at least the first paragraph of the Shema instead of just the first sentence. Um, because the reform movement, there's this phenomenon where what's a centrist? Whatever it is a centrist is, it's in the middle of the spectrum. And as the spectrum moves around, the centrist moves around too. The reform movement at some point got kind of centrist. And it's really difficult sometimes to walk into a reform synagogue and know that you're in one of those as opposed to a conservative synagogue. So much more of this pattern is now followed in the current reform prayer book. It's called Mishkan Tefillah. Much more of it is followed. And you can see the primary name of the book changed to Hebrew. Just the name of the book. We went from Gates of Prayer. The Hebrew name of that was printed on it. No one called it that. Sharei Tefillah, Gates of Prayer. No one called it Sharei Tefillah. When you went into a Reform synagogue, they said, open your Gates of Prayer to page whatever. Walk into a synagogue now in the Reform movement, and they will say, open your Mishkan Tefillah. So you can see just the name of the book and the way the movement thinks about what it's doing has really changed and looks a lot more traditional. It used to be that they had one book for high holidays. Everything fit into one book. There are now 3 books. So they really are taking this more traditional turn, and there's nothing on that what's called classical reform edge very much anymore. There is a Society for the Preservation of Classical Reform Judaism, and it does its own thing. It's very interesting. It's trying to just kind of spruce up the original Union prayer books from the 1930s. I don't know how successful they're going to be with that, but it hasn't worked out very well for them so far, I think. Kathy, I see you're unmuted.
Oh, yeah. I'm still, this isn't really a question, just a thought. I'm just still wrapping my head around the fact that Judaism is based on animal sacrifices. I mean, I think of us as this worthy tradition and very intellectual and moral and ethical, when really the roots are in animal sacrifices. That's just kind of blowing my mind.
Yeah, it's kind of, the rabbis, and to be really honest, the rabbis were very clever. They do not mention this very much in these books. It gets mentioned, but not much. because they really didn't want to focus on that. And there are a lot of reasons. Some of them are actually just kind of geopolitical sort of reasons. And some of them are, this is the way Judaism's going to be. So let's not talk too much about the way Judaism was. We can't have that. We only get that when the Messiah comes. So we're not going to focus too much on that. Didn't stop them from dedicating volumes of Talmud to how animal sacrifices would work, written by a bunch of guys who never saw it happen, right? The very first rabbinic texts is from maybe the 200. The temple was destroyed in 70. No one who wrote that book really ever saw animal sacrifices happen. They were relying on second, third-hand information. Yeah, so Arlene mentions the below the line readings in a Reconstructionist Siddur. And these are very interesting. And almost every Reconstructionist Siddur at the beginning of every service gives you different ways to formulate the brachot. Because realizing that, okay, the brachot are very, melech ha'olam, so that's king of the universe. That's uncomfortable. Maybe we want to think about God as a spirit, right? So there's that. And then the below the line readings are kind of, in the Reconstructionist Siddur, are kind of comments on the stuff that's happening above. And sometimes they are direct comments. In this prayer, blah, 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 blah. And sometimes they are, you could read this as an alternative. And a lot of people go with the alternative. The extent to which your Reconstructionist synagogue is more or less old line Reconstructionism determines how much of that happens. I can't believe I said old line Reconstructionism. Like Reconstructionism is not only 70 years old. So we did all of that. I'm going to put a pin in it. I typed, let's put a pin in that in the slide. And this is the graphic that Microsoft Office suggested to me. So AI is alive and well in PowerPoint. To understand what changes, you need to know what the ideas are. What's going on in the high holidays that makes the changes that create these gigantic books that supposedly you'd go through in a day. But I'm going to ask you, what do we think Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are about? Just unmute. Go ahead, Arlene.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Yes. You can see me. I can't. Okay. I mean, what I think of is looking at what my year choices, life have been over the past year, and how I might like to move forward from there. And looking at, I mean, there is the atonement, so looking at things I could have done differently. I can think of one very recent one, and and reevaluating how I might consider things in the future. I think that's pretty traditional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Larry.
Well, I feel like a bit of a pagan, but I like your answer, Arlene. But frankly, when I was a kid, we went to Rosh Hashanah services, so that's what I do in the fall.
Mhm.
And I feel Jewish, and I like hearing the shofar, which you haven't mentioned.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just, this helps me feel Jewish, right? Ariel says regular annual structured reflection, forgiveness, repair, and evolution, right? that's a big chunk of what we talk about when you come to Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur at Mahar, right? We are not, you know, we're not replacing the sacrifices, and we're not going through long confessional texts. There are such long confessional texts in these traditional Machzorim. We have some, but they're not huge. I think we're good at Jewish guilt without needing a text to impart that to us. So yeah, that's a lot of what we're doing. What we're not doing, even though we use the word, is atonement. When we celebrate Rosh Hashanah, we're very often celebrating a new year. The music is sometimes a little more upbeat, and the message is a little more upbeat, and we're thinking about the coming year, and we're saying goodbye to the year that left. And look, other Jews do that too, but also this is the start of a really intense period of atonement, because the Unatana Tokef prayer, which appears in the Amidah, by the way, says, on Rosh Hashanah it is written, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. Who will live and who will die, who by fire, who by water? Leonard Cohen song. That's where it's from. Is the Unatana Tokef prayer, which is in the big books. We do not have an Unatana Tokef at Mahar. We do mention it, we talk about it, but we don't have that text, because who by fire and who by water, the idea that fate is written into a book and sealed is not a very humanistic concept. It's a very fatalistic concept. It's not necessarily a humanistic one. There are humanistic Jews who believe in philosophical determinism, but that's not the same thing as a book, right? A book opening and people's deeds written in it and who survives. It's a very different thing. So that's kind of our approach is, look, it's what was my last year? What was the last year like? What can I do better? We use some Jewish resources. We use some non-Jewish resources. Some people find that Jewish resources are entirely unhelpful at that time of year. That's okay. You find the things that work. But that's our thinking on it. Kathy says, repairing relationships with people in our lives. So I said, we talk about atonement, right? Atonement is a made-up word. It was invented in order to have a word to use in the King James Bible to describe what happens during the sacrifices. It is literally at one meant. The process meant of becoming at one with who? At one with the God of Israel. That's where that goes. Yom Kippur is translated as Day of Atonement, but Kippur actually means to cover over. It does not mean atone. So what is the traditional understanding of what happens on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? I mean, I talked about the Book of Life, and a lot of people say that's imagery, that's not, that's metaphor. Okay, fine, it's metaphor, whatever, that's fine. What's going on that holiday? Other than very long services. And not eating for a lot of people. What's happening? Or what's supposed to be happening? Is Rosh Hashanah happy? I mean, that's an open question to think about. Is Rosh Hashanah a happy holiday traditionally?
To me, it's a happy holiday. I always think of it as happy. I mean, you have apples and honey, and that's sweet, and you're going to have a sweet new year. Isn't that like Rosh Hashanah?
That's for us. I mean, right. So people do eat apples and honey and honey cake, and this isn't very common in the Ashkenazi world, but in the Sephardic world, it's quite common. Um, there's a ram's head on the table a lot of the time, right? To supposedly Abraham slaughtered the ram for the sacrifice to replace Isaac. That supposedly was on Rosh Hashanah on the place that would become the temple in Jerusalem. Okay. The rabbis say what they're going to say. Right. There are all of these customs that are cheery. And then there's what's happening in a synagogue. And it's not that. Right? There are confessional texts. There are texts that are about the majesty of the God of Israel. These huge flowing poems. Shul, and I'm calling it shul to kind of give it that old-timey feel. Shul is not a happy place. Not really on Rosh Hashanah, and definitely not in Yom Kippur. So what's happening is confession. What's happening is remarking on the awesomeness of somebody that creates the universe, right? All of the food, that's like the pressure valve. That's I spent 8 hours today confessing. I would really, really, really like to feel good right now. And I don't. How do I get to do that? Apples and honey and challah and honey cake, right? So the round challah cycle of life is the same kind of thing, right? These are all things that make a pretty grim time a little better. So this is a grim holiday. And it's a serious holiday. And Yom Kippur is a serious holiday. And unsurprisingly, the book you use reflects that seriousness. So these are a selection of both modern and medieval books on either the laws of Passover, the laws of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, or This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared is a conservative rabbi who was also a Buddhist. His take on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and it is a very personal improvement kind of book. But there's prayer and penitence. Prayer and penitence and good deeds suspend the harsh decree. Right? This is part of the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur liturgy. How do you avoid the bad things that might happen to you? You do good things. Justice and mercy. Right? These two books are commentaries on the Machzor. They're commentaries on the book that's used in synagogues for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur a lot of times. So pretty serious. And then Maimonides just has a section of his Code of Jewish Law called Hilchot Teshuvah, the Laws of Repentance. Just so you know, traditional books don't have such grim titles sometimes. Sometimes they're very matter of fact. And there's all kinds of things you could say about it. Any of these books, they're interesting and whatever else, but it kind of gets across some of the flavor, which is why I picked those book titles. But these are some of the texts that appear in these books, in the traditional Machzor. Melech Elyon. Melech Elyon is a piyut. We're going to hear it a little bit later. Melech Elyon means exalted king. The Amidah on Rosh Hashanah is augmented and has Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot sections. Malchuyot is about kingship, Zichronot is divine remembrance, and Shofarot is shofar service, right? Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, whether you have the traditional version or you have the Barbra Streisand version, which I think a lot of people think is the traditional version. Bochen Levavot, This is Examiner of Hearts. This is a piyut from the Sephardic world, actually, that has become popular in kind of the broader Jewish world because it's very interesting. And there is a modern musical setting for that we're not going to look at tonight, but exists and is pretty interesting. But these are the texts. These are the things that people notice that are important in various forms of Jewish culture that happen on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right? Avinu Malkeinu is recited Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's in both. Melech Elyon is a Rosh Hashanah one because it's about kingship, and Rosh Hashanah in particular is an adaptation of a Babylonian holiday that marked the one of two New Years in the Babylonian calendar, but was about the kingship of the god Baal, and then also whoever your king was. So Rosh Hashanah keeps some of that. Melech Elyon kind of feeds into that. So we're going to take the rest of the time and actually look at this stuff, listen to it, see stuff, to get a sense for what all of this is. And we're going to see how it filters in to what we do and how it filters into kind of popular culture. And we're not going to do the Barbra Streisand one because there's other things to look at. You can always listen to the Barbra Streisand one. You won't necessarily know where to find some of the stuff that I'm going to have. And of course, people who remember Mad Magazine probably remember Spy versus Spy. I had Amidah versus Amidah, right? We're going to compare the traditional holiday Amidah with what happens on the high holidays so you can get a sense for how much changes. And we're actually just going to look at Rosh Hashanah because I scanned in the first three blessings in the Rosh Hashanah Amidah, and it was 20 odd pages. I don't actually know how long the one is for Yom Kippur. I lost count, which kind of gives you a sense for how much expands in Yom Kippur. So I'm going to stop the sharing and share something else. So this is the one I want to share first. So this is, it's in Hebrew. I know, not everybody, you don't have to read Hebrew. It's okay. This says Musaf l'Shabbat. The Musaf service is an additional service that gets tossed in. It's an additional Amidah that gets put in on Shabbat and on biblical holidays. So the Musaf service for Shabbat, the first three blessings of the Amidah. And I'm sharing my screen so you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. Oh, that's a terrible scan. 4 pages. Where's the blessing? You could be forgiven for asking, where in the heck is the blessing here? This one has this heading. That's the word avot, forefathers. So the first blessing in the Amidah is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then in conservative and in more in the world of quote unquote liberal Judaism, which just means conservative and everybody else that's not Orthodox, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah are also added in. But this is an Orthodox Siddur because I wanted to have us do like for like. So the blessing is actually, this starts like a blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu. But the blessing is actually at the end here. Baruch atah Adonai Magen Avraham. Blessed are you, shield of Abraham. This whole paragraph is blessing number 1. The second one is called Gevurot, right? Acknowledging the power of divinity. And so starts Atagi Bor Leolam Adonai, you are powerful forever. Rolls all the way down to here. Baruch atah Adonai mechaye hametim, blessed are you who gives life to the dead. That is how the blessing for Gevurot, for power, that's the blessing for it. Because that's the ultimate power. It's being able to restore life to things that are dead. The stuff in the middle, Mechakel Chayim B'Chesed, you fill all of life with righteousness, and you give life to the dead with great mercy, and you pick up those who have fallen, and you heal the sick, and you release the bound, and you set up righteousness, and you're faithful to those whose faces are in the dust, right? Big power stuff. That's what's happening. This is the second blessing of the Amidah. It's the same during the week, by the way, these first three. The next one is Kedusha is holiness. If you've been at a synagogue where this is recited aloud, you've noticed that people are standing and they do this thing on their tiptoes. So the blessing starts here. The tiptoes are here. Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy. And the idea is not that you bounce the same height each time. It kind of looks like people do that. The idea is that each time you bounce on your heels, you end up a little higher than the time before, because we're going up. And then a lot of this material is Isaiah, Ezekiel. Ezekiel had and Isaiah had visions of what happened in the temple, and they saw angels. And so what the angels say in the Bible is reproduced here. And we get all the way down to the end. Baruch atah Adonai ha'el hakadosh. Blessed are you, the Holy King. Those are the first three blessings. They don't change very much. This one changes on Shabbat as compared to other times of the year or other days of the week. Atah kadosh v'shimcha kadosh. So we have another one, another ha'el hakadosh. This is if you're by yourself, you recite just this paragraph. This is the fourth one. And it's actually not the whole fourth one, but I wanted you to kind of see, okay, these three blessings, this is how much space they take on Shabbat. 4 pages, and actually really only 3. This is what you say when you're by yourself. You don't do this whole thing on the prior page. That's Shabbat. Every week. That's what happens on Shabbat. And then we get that's wrong. That's not the one I wanted to share with you. It's the other one I wanted to share. Here we go. Okay. This is the same thing, but for Rosh Hashanah day 1 in the morning. So this is the Musaf Amidah, this additional Amidah. First blessing starts out pretty similar, but it has changes. And then there's this. This is not in the Shabbat one. We know that the Shabbat one's only 1 page. It's not here either. Where does this thing end? It ends on page 3. So the first blessing is now almost as long as the entire first 3 blessings on Shabbat. And then we start Gevurot, this thing about power. And we go to another page. And finally, It's 2 pages long. Baruch atah Adonai mechayei hametim, gives life to the dead. We are now at the end of page 4. So we've already gone over what was in the Shabbat Musaf Amidah. There are 16 more pages for one blessing. This begins this Kedusha section, this third one that is about holiness. And Afo Rach Mishpechatecha, when you sit in judgment, this is one of the piyutim. This is a poem. And this happens to be an acrostic. So the first line starts with an aleph, the next one with a bet, the next one with a gimel, the next one with a daled, right? Goes in alphabetical order. Piyutim do this a lot, do all kinds of things with the alphabet, because that's part of the challenge of writing the poem is, hey, can I arrange things this way? So that's one piyut. And here's another one. This stuff is usually there. You wouldn't know that except me telling you this stuff is usually there. And then we have another piyut. And then we have another piyut. This is still another one. I did do a book report on this effectively once. Melech Elyon. We're going to hear Melech Elyon in a little bit. We're going to hear this one. And then you kind of keep rolling and you keep rolling and you keep rolling and you keep rolling, and there's more and there's more and there's more. And this is just Rosh Hashanah morning number 1. One blessing. We keep going. We have this Utshuva, Tfilah, Tzedakah, Ma'avirin, et Ro'ah, Hagzerah, repentance, prayer, and righteousness. Set aside the harsh decree, and we keep going, and we keep going, and we keep going. Here's another piyut, and we keep going, and you can see these long comments. And we keep going, 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 and we keep going. Halachez b'yad midat, yet another piyut. This one's an acrostic, but in a different way. Aleph, the next paragraph, bet, the next paragraph, gimel. Everything starts with a hey. And we keep going, and we keep going, and we keep going. And at a certain point, you lose faith you're ever going to get to the end, but it's here. Baruch atah Adonai hamelech hakadosh. Can you imagine the level of exhaustion in comparison to the Shabbat Musaf? 20 pages as opposed to 4. It's long. And so Susan asks, how do we think of this second blessing of the Amidah in terms of what it says about giving life to the dead? Was anybody thinking of this literally? Absolutely. Mechayei hametim is the messianic promise that you will be brought back to life in the messianic age. There are people who interpret it metaphorically now, say, oh, this can mean people feel dead inside and God lifts them up, right? You'll hear that. You'll hear that from rabbis who, when you say, I don't believe in God, they stop and they say, tell me about the God you don't believe in, right? And we get this kind of weird debate that starts to happen. But Orthodox Jews, many don't take this metaphorically. The conservative movement does not necessarily take this metaphorically either. There's a difference between conservative rabbis and the Jew in the pew. And then Susan also asks, are these Hebrew selections from a prayer book for Orthodox or conservative Jews? This is an Orthodox prayer book. The conservative prayer book is a little shorter, but there's still a lot of stuff in it. Is this a springboard or foundational place for our practice and where it should evolve from? I would not say that. What I would say is there's stuff that does filter into us. And if you don't know what's filtering in, you don't know that it's filtering in, which sounds very complicated. Rosh Hashanah day, if you come to Machar's Rosh Hashanah service, we have an Amidah. There is no Amidah in the Kabbalat Shabbat services that I do. We don't do Amidah any other time of the year, but we do it on the high holidays. And it does follow a pretty traditional structure with Malchuyot, Zikr, with kingship, remembrance, and shofar. We have an Amidah that does kind of what the Amidah that we're looking at does. How do we get that? I don't really have an answer to that because it predates me, and it's before Rabbi Nechama, and I'm sure that Rabbi Ben had a hand in it, but it wasn't just Rabbi Ben, right? This is something that our community produced over years, and it looks like the traditional Amidah if you know the structure. If you don't know the structure, you don't know the structure and you don't recognize it for what it is, but that's what this is. That's what's going on is we have an Amidah. Do we have to have an Amidah? No, but we do. And Arlene says, yeah, those are long times in services. None of that 2-hour stuff yet. There's no, the books that I was showing you, these Orthodox books for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they each have an appendix with more of those piyutim. They're not even translated into English because there are some of these things that some communities just really love and they want to do, and it's not the high holidays without this obscure thing. Again, we're not pulling piyutim, but we do pull poetry, right? We do have poems. They function as ours. Turns out a lot of liturgy is just poetry, whether it's humanistic or not. So we're getting that traditional structure. Now we get to look something a little more fun. I'm going to share this, share sound, and let me do this. Okay. Are we seeing a guy? I realize I can't see anybody. If you're seeing a guy, do a thumbs up in the chat.
Yes.
Okay, we are seeing a guy. Okay, this is Ari Goldwag. Ari Goldwag is a Shaliach Tzibor. Listen to this. I'm going to turn my microphone in hopes that you can hear it because Zoom doesn't want to play nice with audio.
We're going to sing a few of the tunes of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the Yomim Noraim, the high holidays. And I'll give you a few thoughts here and there, a few lines, not a lot of speaking, much more singing. And we're going to start off with Ma'ariv.
So, folks who heard it, what did it sound like? You don't have to reproduce the melody.
There's some tune we have at one of the services. It sounds like that. Da 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 da.
Yes, we do. Okay, so what he was singing is the Nusach for Rosh Hashanah. I need to translate his yeshivish for you too, I realized. Moiriv, Mariv, the evening service. Nusachos, okay. Nusach, right? So he's saying, I'm going to introduce you to the Rosh Hashanah Nusach, and I'm going to start with Mariv, and I'm going to start with the important one for Mariv. He doesn't say it's the important one, but it is. And it's da 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 da. That theme gets applied to the words in the Machzor in creative ways. And now I'm going to share exactly what Susan mentioned. This was one of our videos from Rosh Hashanah in 2020 when we were all in our private homes. I have to tell you, I have encountered no humanistic Jewish community anywhere other than ours that uses the Rosh Hashanah evening nusach as the tune for one of our songs. What you heard Ari Goldwag say, we have it. That's the song we end Rosh Hashanah services with. L'Shana Tova Matuka, and it sounds just like that. So how did that? I mean, I would love to know how that happened. I don't think I've ever heard how we ended up with this song. I don't know who wrote it. There's no credit in the sheet music. I have no idea. But look at that. I mean, it's kind of amazing, right? So there's a good chance you've heard that in your life 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago as a child. And Susan says it seems like a glorious and happy tune, right? Maybe they wanted to end the service. It's great. This is a great thing to end the service with if you can get everybody singing, because it's a really upbeat tune, right? I wouldn't want to end it with something else. So this very traditional sound, right? In the most untraditional of places. I mean, other than not going at all. I guess that's untraditional. So I have one other piece, and this is really more popular culture than it is anything else. But we looked at a text called Melech Elyon. I said, here's Melech Elyon. We're going to hear it later. We are going to hear it as soon as YouTube finishes playing a bunch of ads, which hopefully you're not hearing. So turn the volume way down on my speaker so you won't catch it. Okay, here we go. I got to skip. This is excellent. Okay, so this is one of the tunes for Melech Elyon, this thing that expands the Rosh Hashanah Day service by like a couple of pages. Okay. So this is Congregation Beth Jacob in Beverly Hills, but this is a tune that's pretty commonly done for this song, or for this piyut.
Darba marom, adir bamarom, ometz yadot harom, lade yadim loch melech elyon, gibor lehakim, gozer umekim.
Hang in there with it, 'cause there's another.
Goleamukim, lade yadim loch melech elyon. המדבר בצדקה, הלובש צדקה, המאזין צעקה, לדיין ימלוך מלך עליון.
So that was kind of upbeat, right? There's a pep to it. Da 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 da. It's peppy enough, I guess. Has anybody
Right.
ever heard of David Grisman or Andy Statman?
I mean,
So
David Griffin
Dave
was like a
Grisman,
banjo player, right?
mandolin.
Okay.
Susan says, sounds like a carousel at a fair or it's a polka, right?
Right.
So
what's it about?
Dave Grisman and Andy Statman are Jewish. Dave Grisman is a secular Jew, grew up conservative-ish. Andy Statman, no kidding, Chabadnik. Kind of on the liberal end of Chabadnikim, but he's a Chabadnik. They've done a couple of albums of Jewish music together. And this album, this is the second one. It's called New Shabbos Waltz. So David Grisman, there's an album called The Pizza Tapes, which is him playing improvisational music with Jerry Garcia. It's great. You should listen to it, right? Mandolin has two uses in the United States. One is in classical music and the other is in bluegrass. And there's a third one for Irish traditional music. These are bluegrass guys. Andy Statman plays clarinet as well as mandolin. Dave Grisman plays like many, many things with strings. Give a listen to this mandolin tune. Okay. So that's a mandolin being played tremolo. Melech Elyon.
We couldn't hear it.
Yeah.
It was garbled.
So it's basically Andy Statman, and I know it's Andy Statman for a particular reason that we won't worry about, playing on mandolin that Melech Elyon that we heard. And he's titled it New Shabbos Waltz. So he went, I love this tune. Jerry, we should do this tune. Dave, we should do this tune. We're going to do this tune. We're going to call it New Shabbos Waltz. And David Grisman's in the background playing some weird string instruments, and Andy Statman's playing mandolin, and they just grabbed Melech Elyon, called it something different. So you kind of see, it's not just Avinu Malkeinu a la Barbra Streisand that penetrates into popular culture. These are bluegrass musicians who decided, yeah, we're going to do this. Andy Statman does a lot of klezmer too. Dave Grisman is not a klezmer guy. So yeah, listen to the Pizza Tapes. The Pizza Tapes are really good, right? And traditional Americana kind of stuff, which is what a lot of the Grateful Dead stuff, the improvisation on stage, a lot of it was just, you'd call it bluegrass if it wasn't the Grateful Dead. You'd call it bluegrass because that's what it was. So this stuff percolates through in ways that we don't always appreciate. And so I wanted to kind of wrap up with some, yeah, this is grim stuff, but look what it does. Look how Mahar has taken some piece of this, and we have an Amidah that works for us. And we have Lashana Tova Mutuka with the melody that comes right out of what you would hear in an Orthodox shul on Rosh Hashanah Eve. We're using it. Look what David Grisman and Andy Statman decided to do. I'm going to guess the reason you couldn't hear it was because it's all instrumental. And Zoom aims for voice. That's probably what happened. I won't try to do it again. So that's what's going on here with some of this. So all of that is to say there's really interesting stuff, and it comes through in interesting ways. And even though we're humanistic Jews, we have found ways to make those giant books a little bit meaningful for us in ways you wouldn't expect and ways you wouldn't necessarily notice until I put it up on a screen for you and you go, oh, or you hear it. So I'm happy to do questions if folks have questions, although I know we're at 8:35 and I had hoped to end at 8:30, but you know, you can't resist a good song sometimes. Okay, so for the good of the order, I'm going to end the recording and end our session, and it'll go up on YouTube. So if folks want to see it, they can see it that way.